Hello, welcome everyone. Today we're going to be talking about parallel lines and this thing called transversals. So real quick review on parallel and perpendicular lines. So parallel lines, here are parallel lines. We indicate the parallel lines by having these little arrows going in the same direction. So we say P and Q are parallel. We also have an indication for what perpendicular lines are. So perpendicular lines make a 90-degree angle, and that's what this box is here. So we could say lines L and M are perpendicular. So we're going to use this information as we're moving through our lesson today. So our next vocab word is called a transversal. So transversal. So a transversal is a line that intersects two or more lines. Now we have a special case. Our special case is when parallel lines are cut by a transversal. We make several congruent angles. And the angles that are congruent are the corresponding angles. So the colored arcs indicate the corresponding angles, and each of these corresponding angles is congruent. So we have the purple single arc. So these two angles are congruent because we have two parallel lines P and Q being cut by a transversal T. And when we do that, we create these congruent corresponding angles. So we have the two purple ones are congruent, the two blue ones are congruent, the two green corresponding angles are congruent, and the corresponding red arced angles are congruent. Okay, now we also know a few things about these, is that our purple and blue angles here, those are vertical angles, which means these are also congruent. And if these are congruent, then these are congruent. Similarly, the green and the red are vertical angles, so those are all congruent. So really in the end, we just have two different angles. We have an acute angle and an obtuse angle. All the acute angles are going to be congruent. All of the obtuse angles are going to be congruent. All right, so let's go ahead and carry on here. So let's use that information to find some missing measures. So use the figure to find the measures of angle 1 and 2. Actually, let's use it to find the measures of all of these angles that are identified here. So first off, let's look at example A. 110 degrees is this angle here. So the corresponding angle, and again we have two parallel lines A and B cut by a transversal T. We know that the 110-degree angle corresponds with angle number 1, so we know that both of those angles are 110 degrees. So we could say the measure of angle 1 is equal to 110 degrees. Well, what do we know about angle 2? Well, angle 2 is adjacent and on the same line B here. So that means we have a supplementary angle. So measure of angle 2 is supplementary to measure of angle 1. So to find that, we subtract the measure of angle 1 from 110, and the measure of angle 2 is going to be equal to 70 degrees. All right, so let's go ahead and look at example B. So example B, we have a lot of different options to find the missing angles. So let's go ahead and look at angle 1 here. So angle 1 is on the same line M as the 59-degree angle. So that means measure of angle 1 is going to be supplementary to 59 degrees. So 180 minus 59 is equal to 121 degrees. So measure of angle 1 is 121 degrees. Now what about measure of angle 2? Well, that's a vertical angle, right? It's opposite of the 59-degree angle, so we know that's 59 degrees. And we know angle 1 and angle 3 are vertical angles, so that's 121 degrees also. And you start to see a pattern here. All right, now let's go ahead and find 4, 5, 6, and 7 and use our notion of congruent corresponding angles between our parallel lines, L and M, and our transversal T. So let's look at 4 here. 4 is corresponding to 1. So 4 corresponds to 1, which means angle 4 is 121 degrees. Now we can go ahead and use corresponding angles or vertical and supplementary angles to find the rest. Let's just talk about corresponding angles. Angle 5 corresponds to this 59-degree angle. That's 59 degrees. Angles 3 and 6 correspond to each other, so that's 121. And angles 2 and 7 correspond to each other, so they are 59 degrees. And notice, all of the acute angles are congruent, all of the obtuse angles are congruent. So what we can do now is we could say that the measure of angle 1 is equal to the measure of angle 3, which is equal to the measure of angle 4, which is equal to the measure of angle 6, which is, these are all each 121 degrees. Then we have the measure of angle 2 is equal to the measure of angle 5 and the measure of angle 7. Those are all 59 degrees. All right, so go ahead and head on over to the On Your Own. Pause the video, give these a try. All right, so for A, measure of angle 1 is 63 degrees. It corresponds with the 63-degree angle that was given. And then measure of angle 2 is supplementary to angle 1, so that's 117 degrees. For B, again, we can start off with angles 1, 2, and 3. First, angle 1 is vertical to the given 75-degree angle. So that's 75 degrees. And angles 2 and 3 are both supplementary to these angles, so those are 105 degrees. And now we can use our corresponding angles to find 4, 5, 6, and 7. 4 corresponds to 1, 5 corresponds to 2, 6 corresponds to the given 75-degree angle, and 7 corresponds to angle 3. And we have all of the acute angles are 75 degrees, all of the obtuse angles are 105 degrees. All right, so that's good practice, and we should notice some patterns as we're working with these parallel lines and transversals. Before we get into any more of these problems, let's look at some vocabulary. So we have different angle types. So the interior angles of two parallel lines cut by a transversal are called, or are on the inside of the parallel lines. So we have parallel lines P and Q, and we call angles 3, 4, 5, and 6, we call them interior angles because they are on the inside of the parallel lines. So they are in between, on the inside of the parallel lines. Now exterior angles are outside the parallel lines. So angles 1, 2, 7, and 8 are called exterior angles because they're on the outside of the parallel lines. Okay, so we have exterior angles that are outside the parallel lines, interior angles on the inside. Now we can be even a little more specific. We can actually break down our interior and exterior angles into alternating angles. And what we see is that these alternating angles are congruent. And we saw this way back in our examples here, where our alternating interior angles are congruent and our alternating exterior angles are congruent. What we mean by alternating is that we have our transversal here, our transversal T, and they're alternating because they are on the opposite sides of that transversal. So the alternate interior angles are the red single arcs and the blue double arcs. They are on opposite sides of the transversal. And then the exterior ones that alternate again are the blue and red arcs. Notice they are on the opposite sides of the transversal. And what we can say is these are congruent. Okay, the alternating angles are congruent. Let's go ahead and use that information to solve some problems here. So we have a clearance sale sign, and all of the letters are at an 80-degree angle. So here are two parallel lines at 80 degrees, and they are definitely cut by transversal. So this is our transversal here. And we want to know what the angle of measure 1 is. So we could use our knowledge of alternate interior angles for this one, because 80 degrees is going to be congruent to this angle right here, which is the alternate interior angle on the inside of the parallel line. So we know that this is 80 degrees right here. So now angle 1 is supplementary to 180, so 180 minus 80. So measure of angle 1 is equal to 180 minus 80, because it's supplementary. That is 100 degrees. So the measure of angle 1 is 100 degrees. Now similarly, we could have used supplementary angles here and found out that this angle right here was 100 degrees, and then use the fact that this 100 degrees and angle 1 are alternate interior angles to give us 100 degrees. Alright, so let's go ahead and let you practice it on your own. Go ahead and pause and give it a try. Alright, so first talking about relationships, angles 3 and 6 here. So here's 3, here's 6. These are on the exterior. They're on the outside of the parallel lines. So they're exterior angles on the opposite side of the transversal. So they are alternating exterior angles. And then we have 2 and 7. So here's angle 2, here's angle 7. They are on the inside of the parallel lines. So they're interior angles on the opposite sides of our transversal. So alternating interior angles. Alright, so if we know that measure of angle 4 is 84 degrees, how can we find the measure of angle 3? Well, that is supplementary to angle 4, so 180 minus 84 is 96 degrees. Measure of angle 5 is an alternate interior angle of angle 4, so we know that's 84 degrees. And angle 6 is an alternate exterior angle of angle 3, so we know that's 96 degrees. And again, once we find the acute and obtuse angle, we can find the rest of them. Any acute angle is going to be 84 degrees. Any obtuse angle is going to be 96 degrees. All right, well, that does it for our lesson on parallel lines and transversals.